Okay, welcome everyone to this AI ethics seminar, where we have Bernardo Goncalves visiting us for a talk about Alan Turing's intelligent machine, Utopia. We'll have a Q&A in the end, and as usual, feel free to post questions in the chat during the talk, but Bernardo has told me that he might stop at a few points during the talk to pick up questions along the way. So most welcome to take opportunity of that as well. But with that, without further ado, I give the floor to Bernardo. Please, most welcome.
Thank you, Ole, for the invite. Glad to be here with you. So, can you hear me well and see my screen?
This looks good.
Okay. So this talk is based on a recent paper I published in Philosophy and Technology, right? This paper described on the bottom. It's available as open access, so if you like to see it, it's there, okay. All right, so this is 1949 photograph of the digital computer prototype that was under construction at Manchester University when Alan Turing was engaged in discussions about machine intelligence, right? And the newspaper, the Times, the London Times, called it the mechanical brain. So I'm showing you this so that you have you know, the context from where Turing, the context in which Turing was when he presented his views about machine intelligence, right? And for a brief biographical note, also just let you know that I'm originally a computer scientist, and recently I did this second PhD in philosophy, in part as a career move, but also because I wanted to understand Turing's views about machine intelligence. I was very much intrigued by Turing as a historical figure, even when I was an undergrad student in computer science. But especially as, you know, recently AI became more impactful in society. And then I was really wanting to focus on Turing and to really be able to examine, analyze his views and understand why he, because there are so these intriguing statements that he made, right? So I wanted to understand that. Anyway, so a question that we might ask is why to do this today? Why to look back at Turing and the debates that he was involved in back in the mid-20th century, right? And I would say, so once I studied this, you know, got training in philosophy and history, I would say that history is really, it's not uncommon to hear that people saying that history partly repeats itself. And I, particularly in my experience in doing this research, I would say that really the debate we have today about AI is not very different, right, than the one at Turing's time. And this is essentially what I would like to show you today. Back then, digital computers were very rudimentary, right, as we see in this photo. And the discussions were largely based on general foundational concepts, which largely persist today, right? For example, the Turing machine, you know, the discussions about the possibility of a machine to learn for itself, right? This is something that Turing brought forth back then. The possibility of the behavior of a machine being non-periodic in the long run, right? So this is Turing's language that I'm trying to introduce to you. So it's important to observe that Turing was a mathematician, and he tended to think of, even though we had early digital computing as an emergent technology, he tended to think of those things in a very general way, in a very conceptual way, right? And this is what I find most fascinating about Turing, because understood this way, you can appreciate that his views are still relevant, right? So in this sense, history can also provide us perspective, because it allows us to distance ourselves from the present. And there is a lot of, detail, particularly of state-of-the-art technologies in AI, but there is also very general core concepts that are here with us, I would say, since the mid-20th century, okay? Of course, I will not be able today to really, it would require a whole course, to discuss that in depth, but I hope that I can give you a feeling of this, okay? So let's start with these, I would say, the strongest statements that Turing made about the future of machines in society and nature. And he made those statements mostly in 1951, okay, in 2 radio broadcasts. Just a second for me to enlarge the slide here on my side. Okay, so Turing said, if a machine can think, it might think more intelligent than we do. Even if we could keep the machines in a subservient position, for instance, by turning off the power at strategic moments, we should, as a species, feel greatly humbled. A similar danger and humiliation threatens us from the possibility that we might be superseded by the pig or the rat. And here he's being kind of ironic, right? And he continues, this is a theoretical possibility which is hardly controversial, but we lived with pigs and rats for so long without their intelligence much increasing, that we no longer trouble ourselves about this possibility. But this new danger is much closer. If it comes at all, it will almost certainly be within the next millennium. It's remote, but not astronomically remote, and is certainly something which can give us anxiety. So it's interesting that he distinguished it's remote, but not astronomically remote, right? What can we make of this? Well, I say Turing is concerned with our emotional response to a question we might call ontological, right? Whether there could be some species that would eventually surpass the human race in intelligence power. So this is a question of being. Is it possible? Is it materially possible? Is it theoretically possible? And well, is it materially possible? And he reminds us that we humans have held this dominant position among the species, but this position is not necessarily permanent, right? And he alludes to the pig and the rat. His carefully chosen examples to point out, somewhat ironically, our sense of superiority over other species, right? And he shifts the discussion to the time scale of possible events, since the evolution of machines, in his view, right, would not be subject to the same time scale of natural evolution. So it's really striking that he's thinking about machines as a species in terms of evolutionary theory, right? And this is, and because he's being ironic, we might ask, was he joking, right? Or was he trying to make a serious point? Because it's really ambiguous, right? So in his other 1951 broadcast, I would say that he shifts a bit the focus from ontology to ethics, right? Let's see. He says, let's now assume, for the sake of argument, that these machines are a genuine possibility. So he's saying, well, if you don't agree with that, okay, but let us make this an assumption and look at the consequences of constructing them. And now he's focusing on this, right? There would be great opposition from the intellectuals who were afraid of being put out of a job. It's probable, though, that the intellectuals would be mistaken about this. And here he comes with more irony, okay? He says, there would be plenty to do trying to understand what the machines were trying to say. That is, in trying to keep one's intelligence up to the standards set by the machines, for it seems probable that once the machine thinking method had started, it would not take long to outstrip our feeble powers. At some stage, therefore, we should have to expect the machines to take control in the way that is mentioned in Samuel Butler's Aaron. Okay, so here it's striking that he focuses on this particular figure in society, right? The intellectuals who would be afraid of losing their jobs. And then he makes this projection that once machine intelligence comes, it would not take long for machines to take control. And then he mentions Butler's Victorian novel, Aaron, as an inspiration. Again, we may ask, was he joking? To what extent was he joking, right? And or was he trying to make a serious point? And it's important to remember that back then, it was a really bold move, right? To say that people would be occupied trying to understand what machines are saying, right? I would say that, well, I will not at all say today that I think present-day AI achieves exactly what Turing foresaw. Okay, we are gonna discuss more about that, but there are many important aspects in his vision of the future, which were really quite original. Of course, there were general discussions, even in fiction, for example, Butler, about the future of machines and machines taking control, and he takes inspiration in Butler. But his discussion is much more grounded, right, in mathematics, in computer technology, and so on. And so he makes these bold moves in thinking about the future. Right. So back to the question, was he joking or not? Biographers, historians, philosophers, scientists, even novelists, right, have answered this question differently, right? In my research, I found that there are many different perspectives. I have identified these three central or main images of Turing, and the order here is not important, okay? First, a utopian, radically progressive thinker, a sort of, scientific version of the Romantic poet Percy Shelley. So this came from a contemporary of Turing. Okay. There is also the image of Turing as a politely humorous figure, an infantilized genius. His voice was muted. He was not very influential at in his time, right? And there is this third image, that of an irresponsible scientist, perhaps reminiscent of Mary Shelley's dystopian character, Dr. Victor Frankenstein. Okay, so these are all possible interpretations of Turing's personality. Okay, if you go to Andrew Hodges' great biography of Turing, Alan Turing, The Enigma, you will find elements of these images all over the book. Okay, and in fact, Hodges' biography is all based on first-hand accounts of Turing coming from his contemporaries, people who met him and shared experiences with him and so on. Okay, so and of course these are perspectives, right? There may be differences in how people perceive each other, right? How Turing's contemporaries perceived him, right? And here I'm separating the images so that we can have more clarity about them, right? However, what struck me is that while the second and the third images of Turing, the infantilized genius and the responsible scientist, while these images have been widely disseminated in the secondary literature, the first, which portrays Turing as a nonconformist, a radical thinker, has not been explored. I could say has barely been explored, but I do think that it's not explored at all, right? And I did find that Turing's ironic and humorous attitude has led most interpreters to either caricature or downplay his vision of the future, right? While a close and sustained examination of his arguments was lacking. Okay, so this was the main motivation for my research. Okay. We can talk more about these three images later, maybe in the Q&A session, right? In the remainder of this talk, I will discuss these three. I will have these three parts. First, Turing's method of irony, or how to understand his use of irony. Then I will discuss what Turing himself called, and this is very interesting, he himself formulated this expression, Promethean irreverence, but he denied being guilty of his irreverence, right? So, and this will address this ethical aspect of his views on the future of machines. And finally, I will discuss, this key aspect of his perspective, which is seeing machines as a species. Is there some sense in this, right? What was he trying to say? So the question about whether he was joking or not probably has a lot to do with this perspective, right? Is there any sense in to see machines as a species? All right, so this last part will address the ontological aspect of his views, right? I'm distinguishing this ethical and ontological aspects of his views just to have clarity. Not that he himself didn't use those words, okay, ontology, ethics, but I'm using it just to make things clearer. Okay. So any question at this point?
Feel free to ask. Otherwise, I think we can move on.
Let's move on. Right. There is this event in June 1949 that I think illustrates very well Turing's use of irony and how it was received at the time, how his irony was received, right? This person, this gentleman, is Jeffrey Jefferson. He was a professor of neurosurgery at the University of Manchester, okay? And he was aware of Turing's project at the same university, right? Because in this year, 1949, Turing was there at the University of Manchester. And on the occasion of receiving his Lister Medal Award, which recognizes British surgeons, Jefferson gave this talk, The Mind of Mechanical Man, okay? And this was a strong critique of the possibility of machine intelligence, and was one of the main events, I would say, that led Turing 6 months later to propose his famous test for machine intelligence, right? Jefferson and Jefferson's Lister oration have a lot to do with the Turing test.
Bernardo?
Hi.
Can you take a question at this point?
Sure.
Wilhelm raised his hand.
Bernardo, very interesting.
Hi, Wilhelm.
Talk so far. Just curious about how did you approach Turing's thinking? Is your argument mainly depending on his sort of peer-reviewed academic writing? Is it his public outreach, or could it perhaps be secondary sources or some other type of data source?
Thanks for the question. Yes. So my research is essentially based on primary sources, right? I studied Turing's own communications and writings, and I pay special attention to history. I've been, building chronologies of concepts in his thinking, for example, machine intelligence, how his concept of machine intelligence evolves over time in his own writings, okay? Of course, I engage with secondary literature also, especially Hodges, right? Because Hodges' biography is so great and the foundational work for any Turing scholarship, right? But it's mostly based on primary source.
Okay,
thank you. Jefferson makes this critique, right, of machine intelligence, and it influences Turing. There are other events I will not cover today that, we see that Turing wanted to respond to Jefferson. But anyway, this particular event in June 1949 will be interesting for us to appreciate Turing's use of irony, okay? So on the next day after Jefferson's talk in London, he gave this talk, this high-profile talk in London, the Times covered it, and the reporter emphasized Jefferson's, I would say, two main demands that Jefferson makes so that he would accept the idea that a machine could think or a machine could be intelligent, okay? The first is that the machine would have to be capable of creating concepts and using words cleverly, otherwise it would be no better than a parrot, okay? The second demand is that the machine should be able to write a sonnet based on thoughts and emotions felt, okay? You may know about this because in the end this becomes famous. For example, these words from Jefferson, but not until a machine could write a sonnet or a concerto because of thoughts and emotions felt and know it had done so, could they agree, the reporter referred to Jefferson, right, that machine equaled brain. Turing will quote from these words in his famous Mind paper, okay? But anyway, on the next day, so this is one day Jefferson gives the talk, the next day it's covered in the Times. The next day, the Times publishes Turing's response, okay? The reporter sought a response from Turing's laboratory at the University of Manchester, and it was almost like an accident because Max Newman, the director of the laboratory, was not there, and Turing was, and Turing pick up the phone, and Turing responds instead of Max Newman. And then Turing gives this fascinating response. He said, as you may know, I do not think you can even draw the line about sonnets, though the comparison is perhaps a little bit unfair because a sonnet written by a machine will be better appreciated by another machine. So again, the use of irony. Actually, this one is earlier than the ones I showed you before. This one is in 1949, okay? And 3 days later, so this priest, this Catholic priest and theologist sees, Turing response and writes a letter to the Times. The letter is published 3 days after Turing's own words appeared in the newspaper. And the priest urged, the quote, responsible scientists to dissociate themselves from Turing's research program. Okay, so this may give you a feeling of the context of the tensions involved, right, in this public debate. Also, it was a high moment of the Cold War. Okay, so anything, not anything, but the idea of machines thinking. Of course, people immediately perceived the impact of that would make in society, right? So these figures, for example, this important priest and theologist noticed the importance of that and wanted to engage, right? And then a few days later, the British Medical Journal publishes Jefferson's talk in written, and the journal's editorial note reproduced Turing's comments to the Times and concluded, probably he did not mean this to be taken too seriously. Okay. And here, so I take this to show that it's interesting because it seems that Turing's use of humor opened up the possibility that his heretical statements could be interpreted as a mere joke. Okay. And apparently this was good because, it created this sort of artificial tolerance, right? And Turing was able to continue to engage in the public discussion by using irony, right? And in fact, my suggested interpretation of Turing's use of irony is this. I draw here from commentary made by an English, so this is secondary literature, right? Just in terms of comparing, relying for interpreting Turing's use of irony in the 20th century. I'm relying on an interpretation, a contemporary interpretation of David Hume's use of irony back in the 18th century, okay? also British. And this scholar, this English literature scholar, John Price, he emphasizes how Hume used irony as a method, right? When a man was under the intellectual and cultural pressure which Hume experienced, he could not respond easily by denunciations, by shouting, or by threats. As a civilized man, Hume would not have responded that way under any circumstance. His method of dealing with those who would persecute him or ostracize him simply because of his religious or philosophical or moral opinions was subtle and effective. Irony gave him a method of operating in a world that found his ideas both strange and shocking. And he concludes, irony could at least create artificial tolerance. So I think this is very useful for us to appreciate Turing's use of irony, because I see it as, let's say, as a defensive tactic, right? As a way to defend himself and to be able to expose his views, even though the environment was hostile, okay? In short, I would suggest we can interpret Turing's irony as satire, or irony with a point, right? Irony, he used irony, but that doesn't mean that he was doing expressing a mere joke, okay? Right, but then if I'm saying that Turing was not joking and was really trying to make a serious point, perhaps two questions need to be answered, right? First, why would Turing have thought that building intelligent machines was ethically justified, right? Because if he was serious about that, perhaps he had done some thinking, right? Even in terms of the ethics of the problem. And the second question is, did Turing really think that human-like intelligent machines are possible, right? And the answer for the second question is yes. He thought that machine intelligence could evolve up to approximate human intelligence very closely, right? He didn't think that machine intelligence could ever be identical to human intelligence in terms of the principles, in terms of the let's say the anatomy and the physiology, right? He distinguished those things. For example, he described digital computers as discrete state machines, while living beings as continuous state machines, right? And he was careful about using the word machine to refer to living beings. He most often he used the concept of analogy, right? He thought that it was not a bad analogy to think of living beings as continuous state machines. Anyway, so I will try to give you an idea of how actually the context he was thinking, so that he considered this view and this possibility that really intelligent machines were possible. And I wouldn't say that, you know, things like ChatGPT match what Turing was thinking, right? Because of there are important distinctions to make. Yes, in terms of the Turing test, okay, but not in terms of the machines he was trying to develop, okay? Okay. This notion of Promethean irreverence that I think Turing actually engaged in, even though he denied, is also something that I would like to bring some context, okay, so that we can think about it better in terms of the context he was in. So I think the best way, perhaps, to understand Turing's ethical argument is to revisit his participation in another polemic. So I would ask you to bear with me for a while on this story, and we soon will appreciate the core element of Turing's ethical argument. Let me just check with Ole about the time. How much time we have, Ole? I forgot to start
if you want to save 15 minutes for discussion at the end, you have 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So I'll have to rush a bit. Okay, so we have seen Turing's contribution to a public debate in June 1949, right? And now I will refer to another polemic, this polemic that may be helpful here, in which he participated. And this one started in October 1946, when this gentleman on the left, Louis Mountbatten, a top British statesman, gave a speech and referred to digital computers using the term electronic brain. His speech, in the end, exposed the British National Project, which was secret by then, their project to build a digital computer, which they called the ACE, right? The Automatic Computing Engine. And the ACE was being designed by Turing himself, at the National Physical Laboratory, the NPL, where Turing worked. And Mountbatten was briefed by Turing about the ACE before he makes this speech, okay? But the NPL senior management didn't like Mountbatten's speech, you know, and even less the media frenzy it created. And then they sent letters to the Times trying to, you know, distance their project from Mountbatten's claims, particular his use of the term electronic brain. So I will just try to buy some time here. So we have essentially two figures. This is one, Douglas Hartree, and this is the second one, Charles Darwin, the director of the NPL at the time. He was a grandson of the famous evolutionary theorist, Charles Darwin. And both Hartree and Darwin sent letters to the Time, criticizing, you know, trying to detach themselves from Mountbatten's claims. Darwin says, in popular language, the word brain is associated with the higher realms of the intellect, but in fact, a very great part of the brain is an unconscious automatic machine. And this is important, these words, you know, unconscious machine, because this is Turing's language that Darwin reproduces in his letter, okay? And then he says, this is the only part, the lower parts of the brain. This is the only part of the brain we may aspire to imitate. The new machines will in no way replace thought. Okay, so both Hartree and Darwin were, and I have a lot of detail about this polemic, okay, and there is a paper to come out soon about it. They both protected essentially these, what they call higher intellectual activities for humans, right? And we may ask materially, who were the, because these higher intellectual activities were developed by programmers, right, who were mathematicians at the time. And it seems that, well, they are reserving So in part, they are avoiding the idea that machines will, you know, be as intelligent as humans, but also socially, they are protecting the jobs, right? The activities of these mathematicians. Okay, and then in doing that, they were, I would say, neglecting the jobs of the human computers, those who did, you know, large-scale computing at the time, and by the way, were essential to the Allies' effort in the Second World War. Okay, because this was all post-war developments, right? And then 3 months later, Turing would make you know, a master-slave dichotomy. He will talk about masters and slaves as a dominant theme at the climax of his lecture on the ACE to the London Mathematical Society. I didn't mention Hartree complained about the use of the words brain, memory in connection with computers, but he was okay with the word master because parts of computers were named. For example, there was a component of the ENIAC, the North American machine, that was named Master Programmer. And Hartree didn't even notice it. But, you know, Turing, speaking to the London Mathematical Society, would say, I have already mentioned that the ACE will do the work of about 10,000 computers. And of course, he's referring to human computers in this passage, mostly women, right, whose jobs were threatened by early digital computers. And he continues, the intention in constructing these machines in the first instance is to treat them as slaves, giving them only jobs which have been thought out in detail. So Turing's language is just, you know, he exposes everything, things that are kind of hidden, you know, societal issues that are hidden, and he just exposes them. So it's fascinating to see his statements. And then he asks, is it necessary that they should always be used in such a manner? So he's contrasting how computers were being used or were being imagined, and saying that we should imagine them in another way. It's not necessary that they always should be used, you know, to speed up calculations as slaves, or just doing things that people wouldn't call intelligent, right? And this has a lot to do with, you know, some social division of labor, okay? Anyway, so he continues, roughly speaking, those who work in connection with the ACE will be divided into masters and servants. And then as time goes on, the calculator itself will take over the functions both of masters and servants. And then the masters will refuse to do this. They may be unwilling to let their jobs be stolen, okay? And then they would excuse, you know, make excuses couched in well-chosen gibberish whenever any dangerous suggestions were made. I think that a reaction of this kind is a very real danger. So my point, which I think may help clarify Turing's ethical take or position in this debate about building intelligent machines, is that actually in the context, he was the one concerned with people who were actually being displaced by machines at the time, okay? And then he was saying, essentially, so what is the reason we are displacing some people now, and we are guaranteeing that other people will not be displaced later, right? I think he's almost saying, if we praise automation, why is it not automation for all? Okay. he was observing the automation of jobs considered of lower status and the protection of jobs considered of higher status. So this is behind the high language about, you know, intelligence, human intelligence and everything. Okay. So you may now recall the first image of Turing, which portrays him as a nonconformist, you know, a radical thinker and a utopian, right? And in fact, he was quite different from his colleagues in the sense that, well, he was a homosexual living in post-war Britain, and he was, I would say, he was crying for freedom, right? Something he could not imagine in his own time and place. And this seems to lead him to a utopian mindset and to imagine machines that would be even nicer, you know, than humans. The machines he envisions would be kind, you know, friendly, have initiative, have a sense of humor, fall in love, enjoy strawberries and cream, make someone fall in love with it, and so on. And for him, these were possibilities of the near future rather than utopian dreams. But it's interesting for me, I think that here he's almost confessing that these were in fact utopian dreams, right? He was trying to propose this other way to imagine machines. Machines were essentially at the time used for warfare, okay? And he was the one who was imagined, you know, more relaxed, or even, how can I say, maybe better, you know, or more inspiring uses of machines, okay? Right, and so because I'm saying that Turing was utopian, at least this is the way I interpret him, it's one of those images, and it's the one that I think it's underexplored, and I'm developing it, right? One could say, well, but utopias, you know, utopias may go wrong, and we have often we have seen utopias going wrong, right? But Turing, so at least this we can say, I think, Turing was an individual who turned away from power, right? He was at the center after the war. He was at the center of the industrial and military initiatives in Britain, right? And he just, you know, decides to leave the NPL, to go to Cambridge, and then to go to Manchester and stay at the university. And then he eventually shifts his research to mathematical biology, again, maybe turning away from, you know, the high profile discussion about computers. So I would say his utopia cannot be compared to the techno utopias of billionaires that we have today. Okay, so this is, I think, is an important point. In fact, his intelligent machines would be raised and educated like a child. Okay, Max Newman, his colleague and friend, remembered Turing saying, proud owners would say, my machine instead of my little boy said such a funny thing this morning. Not that we don't have this today at all. We have some of that, but there is a very important difference here, which is the following. For Turing, the educator of an intelligent machine is a person, right? The machine is supposed to be raised by someone, right? Again, because he interprets machines as you know, companions, things that would engage with us humans in a very fun and interesting way, and in a way that has nothing to do with commercial purposes or industrial purposes, right? The educator of a machine for Turing is a person, not a nation state, not a large corporation, right? Okay, so in terms of Turing's, what I call Turing's Promethean irreverence, I will just, there's this chronology here, all based on primary sources. What is important here is to note that his, let's say, irreverence was not a reckless, thoughtless, isolated phenomenon in his career. It was actually a consistent position that he held for years, right? There are these objections. I will not talk about them. We will just skip them. But you know, these objections in 1948 and in 1950, they contain the essence of, you know, the same statements that we have seen at the beginning of the talk in 1951. Okay. All right. So here I will not have much time. Maybe I will just rush a bit here, say the main ideas, and then we move to the Q&A session, and we can go back to this if there is time. Okay. My goal here with this part was to present to you the context from which Turing thought machines could in fact evolve and surpass humans in intelligence power. Okay. On consciousness, for example, in his mind paper, he wrote, "I do not wish to give the impression that I think there is no mystery about consciousness. But I do not think these mysteries necessarily need to be solved before we can answer the question, which is, you know, can machines think?" So what can we make of this? To interpret that, my proposal is to appreciate, so Turing was influenced not by one person like Samuel Butler, but perhaps Butler's influence on Turing has been underexplored, okay, in comparison with, you know, for example, Wittgenstein and others. And I think this is important for us to appreciate Turing's mindset, okay, and his view of machines as a species in terms of evolutionary theory, okay. Butler was a contemporary and critic of Charles Darwin, okay, in the 19th century. And Butler wrote nothing less than 5 books, these 5 books listed here, satirizing Charles Darwin. He thought that Darwin, with his mechanistic principle of evolution by natural selection, had neglected the problem of the origin of life and the origin of consciousness. Okay, so this is an important aspect of Butler's critique of Darwin. And Turing was educated in the early 20th century, right? And Charles Darwin, the evolution of Charles Darwin's the perception of Charles Darwin's theory has gone through ups and downs in the 20th century. Okay, and Butler was an important figure in the English literature scene at the time. Okay. So we know from a report by Turing's mother that Butler's Arum, the first book in this list, was one of Turing's favorite books in his teenage years. And she even thought that Butler's book inspired Turing to come up with his project of building intelligent machines. And there is more. After the war, Turing became close friends with Nicholas Furbank, who was a biographer of Butler. He even named Furbank his will executor later. Okay, so let's see quickly this passage from Butler's book, Unconscious Memory. Butler talks about, you know, cats and how cats think our shoestrings are alive when they see us lacing them, because they see the tag at the end, jump about without understanding all the ins and outs, all the mechanisms, right? Of course, this is not new. This is something that was discussed even in the Renaissance with Descartes and the Renaissance automata. Okay, but Butler's discussion is specific in that it's a critique of Charles Darwin. It's contemporary with Charles Darwin. Okay, and Butler continues with another example, and here I ask you to keep in mind Turing's imitation game and tests. Okay, Butler says, suppose a toy mouse so constructed that it could imitate eating and drinking and could make as though the mouse were cleaning its face with its paws. Should we not at first be taken in ourselves and assume the presence of the remaining facts of life, though in reality they were not there? Okay, so essentially Butler's point is that after Darwin, you know, we cannot be sure about the origin of consciousness and the origin of life. Maybe evolution produces these machines, which are, of course, living beings. We living beings have evolved, and maybe we are just, you know, sophisticated mechanisms. And then what we perceive as consciousness is nothing but something that emerged from the complexity of mechanisms. So this would be one interpretation, just, you know, that consciousness may be an empty concept or an emergent property. The second interpretation is that consciousness might be something that is omnipresent, something that was present all the time in every molecule of matter. Okay, so he thinks that Charles Darwin's theory destroys the separation between the organic and the inorganic, and maintains whatever the organic is, the inorganic is also. Okay, so I think this is I'm approaching this as work in progress. Okay, my point here today is to say that I think this is perhaps the best context to explore and understand Turing's views about the future and about the evolution of machines. Okay, so for example, we may see Turing's strong statements about machines surpassing humans in intelligence in terms of, for example, if anachronically we think of that in terms of present-day AI, this is one thing, but maybe we could also bring artificial life research, right? Because it's not based on Turing machines, essentially. So I don't expect that this will reach you in a very clear way right now, but maybe it's provocative enough and we could continue the discussion. Okay. So this is just a wrap up of the how can we see how we can see Turing's argument about the future of machines. So I think it's not only that, but one interesting perspective is to see it as a utopian satire, right, directed against authority figures, especially these protectionist, I would say protectionist intellectuals. He did believe that machines, his machines were not utopian dreams, but he, of course, he conceived them from a utopian mindset. Okay, aspiring to a better society. His ever-learning child machines, their intelligence would grow out of their own individual experiences, you know, not from a download of the internet as we have today with present-day AI. And they would still rival and surpass intellectuals. So, for example, the amount of energy a child machine, in Turing's sense, would spend, I think it's nothing compared to what we have to train these deep learning machines, right? And Turing, I think it's a very interesting perspective on Turing to see him as an evolutionary theorist, right? And digital computers were important for him because they were one way to get empirical results, okay? But not that digital computers were that important for him, for his research, okay? So I'll stop here. Thank you, Ollie and all.
Thank you very much. I didn't want to interrupt you because this was so fascinating, but you've eaten up all the Q&A time.
Oh my God,
we have.
sorry.
But no problem at all. And people should feel free to leave, but I think we should still open up for one or two questions from the audience. Can you take down the slide so we can see each other?
Yes. Pause share, stop share.
Yes.
Yes.
So again, thank you very much. We're opening up the floor for a few short questions or comments.
Yes, about machines like me. Sorry, go ahead.
I have one question. So you had these three sort of images of Alan Turing, and I would say that I personally would sympathize with the first and the third, with the sort of revolutionary and maybe as the irresponsible scientist. But maybe that's because also I'm coming from sort of mathematical biology, so I have that picture of him as well. But do you know, I mean, so from, do you think that, because you said that the sort of middle perspective was sort of overrepresented, would you say that that's true among scientists as well, or is there a sort of, is there a difference between where people are coming from, the view they have of Turing?
Yes, for example, these AI scientists, Pat Hayes and Kenneth Ford, in 1995, they wrote this, they actually gave this keynote address. Let me, Patrick Hayes and Kenneth Ford. I.J. Kai, 1995. They gave this keynote address entitled "The Turing Test Considered Harmful," and there they express exactly the third image. They say that Turing, we should dismiss Turing's ghost, something like that, because Turing's view of AI is like is like as if we were like Frankenstein's building a human monster, you know, things like that. So they seem to share this third image of Turing. Hodges himself uses rights, but Turing was like a Shelley, but he was also there was also a Frankenstein in him. The arrogance of pure scientists, something like that. Well, I met Hodges recently. I think he was not. It was not a big claim of his. You know, it's more like he says it's more like in passing it's more like he's giving this other perspective as a boundary to think about Turing. So of course, it's a matter of perception, right? I would say that Turing turned between the utopian and dystopian modes, but not playing the dystopian actor, but more like giving dystopian reflections, right? And in that sense, there is another AI scientist, Drew McDermott, who says Turing was his own Mary Shelley, which I think is a very interesting note on Turing, because how can you know, a Frankenstein, an actual Frankenstein-like scientist, bring up the whole discussion about, well, we have to think about machines, we have to think about the future. This is not Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, right? Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is more like an unconscious scientist who is just pursuing his will and is not caring much, and then creates the monster and abandons the monster. So Turing is proposing that these machines should be educated and grown, raised as childs, right? So I think it doesn't fit very well with Turing, but of course, there is a lot of ambiguity, and we can explore these aspects, right?
Yeah.
Not sure if I answered the question.
Oh, thanks for the answer.
We should move on. We have a question from Gerardo.
Yeah, very interesting talk, Bernardo. So, muito obrigado.
Thank you.
My question is related to the following statement that there were many quotes there where Turing made clear statements about how machine could be, even act like humans almost, yeah? At the same time, in later years, I mean, Penrose and many other people have been in this debate between, okay, is our thinking algorithmic or not? So how much can we do more than machine? How much machine can do more than us? And Turing, of course, one can have ideas, one can speculate, one can think about, oh, I think in the future it will happen. But given that you have been digging into his source, his primary source, what he wrote and his opinion and everything, did you find any evidence that he thought that machine could be super intelligent in the sense of going beyond, first of all, algorithmic thinking, or whether he has these himself opinions or about that in particular?
Yes. Thanks, Gerardo, for this great question. Well, there is this debate, right, about, for example, the Penrose. So in the secondary literature, there are phases. There are some phases. There is a point when people started to, I think Jack Copeland raised, and others raised a question that, well, Turing has this conception of machine from 1938, from his PhD thesis at Princeton, the Oracle machine. So maybe I should just share with you, I have a slide here about this, right? I think it may help. Do you see my slide? Okay. So these are the various conceptions of machine that appear in Turing's writings. Okay, so these two conceptions, the choice machine of 1936 and the Oracle machine of 1938, eventually in the secondary literature, some people will claim that these were models of machine that Turing proposed. And well, he didn't have time to develop. He left things unfinished, right? But we should explore those models of machine because those are not algorithmic and more. So they coined this term hypercomputation, okay? So computation beyond the Turing limit. And this became a discussion about a discussion in theoretical computer science, okay, which I didn't follow very closely. But I would say that we can think about, so for example, the unorganized machines and the learning machines, which I think Turing associate with intelligent behavior, okay, those, the other ones, he either almost explicitly says that, or he suggests that they are not related with intelligent behavior at all, or the choice and the oracle machines, he presents those conceptions. The choice machine, he just mentions it in the 1936 on computable numbers paper. And the oracle machine, I think it's something that he presents in a very technical context of mathematical logic, and then later he doesn't follow up with this term, okay? But I do think that when he's discussing the unorganized machine and the learning machine, which I think is the same, okay, it's just a development of the concept and a change of the name. He is engaging in, he is proposing a model of machine that is not algorithmic, but not because it's, you know, quantum physics or something like that. But because it's a machine that is under frequent interference with the environment, okay? And this is important because when we think of a Turing machine, or what we call today an algorithm, the behavior of an algorithm, by definition, an algorithm is something that receives an input, and we can think of Turing's machines and the tape, right? It reads from the tape, and then it performs, you know, computation, and then it writes an output on the back on the tape. And when it's performing computation, it cannot be interrupted, right? It's just so let's think in more high-level terms about this, right? There is this concept of solipsism in philosophy, right? A solipsist being is a being that is not interacting with the environment, is not sure whether, you know, the things exist in the external world. It's something that is closed to itself, right? So I would suggest that we think of a Turing machine or an algorithm in terms of a solipsistic machine. It reads, its interactions with the environment are very well defined, and it gets input and does computation in this frozen world, in a completely in a complete neglection of what's going on out there in time and space, right? It's just doing the computation, and then at the end it delivers the output. So I would ask you, when we think of, so maybe I will just stop the slides so that we can see each other again. This is the experience I have with ChatGPT, because ChatGPT is very sophisticated in the sense that it has a variance of a very large base of behavior, in the sense of, you know, reading this and responding that. But it's not synchronous with us. It's not there. When we are there in the interaction, it's not there. It's just waiting for it's out waiting for what we give, and then it reads it, goes on, does what it does, and then delivers back the output. So I think this is important. This is an interesting way to think about And Turing was thinking of machines that wouldn't behave like that, okay? But that doesn't mean that we have to go to quantum physics, okay, to think of Turing's machines, Turing's intelligent machines.
Thank you.
Not sure if I contributed, Gerardo, but I would be happy to follow up even later if you like.
Thank you very much, Bernardo. We are over time, and I believe we have to round off this session, but it's been a very fascinating session. Thank you for delivering these extremely interesting remarks, and thanks to everyone who contributed and those who stayed here despite our running over time. I'm stopping the recording now, officially closed.